Hey all you whiskey lovers. I visited the first whiskey distillery in Spain, the Sackman, and I want to talk to you about it. So, where is this distillery? Well, thank God it's just in Madrid, or I shouldn't say just in, it's about 30 minutes south of Madrid. And I would heavily recommend taking this drive down. I was in Madrid for work, and while I was there, came across the Sackman and had to think about it for a moment and decide, okay, am I going to drive 30 minutes south, or again, Uber actually, and go 30 minutes south to check it out? And I am so happy I did. Now you might be thinking, Sackman, that's a crazy name for a distillery. It is, but I really like why they named it that. The Sackman is like a boogeyman in Hispanic cultures. And what the Sackman does is when kids are out on the street, picks them up and throws them in his sack. So he's something you should be afraid of and try to avoid whenever you can, which is weird for a whiskey. And when you look at the beginning of, or let's say the entrance of the distillery, it looks like this. It stands out and it's bold, but I get it. It really fits the vibe. And once you're inside on the right-hand side of the bar, you're greeted with the Sackman. It's kind of intimidating. It makes you rethink this whiskey. But the reason the distillery and the cocktail bar is called the Sackman is actually very interesting, and I love the reasoning behind it. I can tell you from my personal experience, it's a huge risk opening a distillery. It's a lot of money, it's a lot of time, and you really don't know what it's gonna be like. Your first few whiskeys, will they be good, will they be bad? It's a risk, and it's scary. So is the Sackman. So they use the Sackman as kind of a motivational fact to say, hey, let's break away from what scares us and let's be bold and let's try something new and dangerous potentially. Scary for sure. And they did it. And I'm really happy they did. While I was there, I was lucky enough to try two of their whiskeys, their new whiskey and their Sackman number 5, as well as a few cocktails. But we'll talk about all that later. If you check out their website, they have a whole bunch of different products. And by the way, nobody paid me to kind of talk about them. I just liked the experience so much, and I've traveled and visited so many distilleries that I thought, hey, let's try to film it and let's talk about it. So as you can see, whole bunch of whiskey, whole bunch, most of it's sold out unfortunately, but a bunch of beers are also available, and they even have a moonshine. Well, not right now, but maybe if you check out their website later, you can get your hands on some. Might be interesting. But I started off with the new. And what is interesting with the new whiskey is it's not actually whiskey. So what do I mean by that? Well, new, kind of like with our bottles where we call it FLF, new is an abbreviation. It stands for No es whiskey, which means not actually whiskey. Now, why isn't this real whiskey? Well, are these in different grains? Did they add something to it? No. New No es whiskey is actually a 14-month-old whiskey. And because the fact that it's 14 months old would mean that I shouldn't be calling it whiskey while I'm in Europe. In the US, theoretically you can, but as soon as you bring that product into Europe, where we have a rule where your whiskey has to be aged for a minimum of 3 years, of course, this is not going to work anymore. So it's No es whiskey. Very clever, I loved it. Now, when tasting it, I have to say, they market it, it's on their website, and they talk about it being looking like whiskey, tasting like whiskey, and smelling like whiskey. And they are right, it looks like whiskey. It smells, in my opinion, and I drink a lot of, let's say, maturing whiskey that needs to be aged longer. This is exactly that. The nose is not bad. It's not very strong. It's not very pungent or forward bringing. Like you're not picking up a lot of what you're going to taste. But you get a little bit of like malty flavors, what you expect, a little bit of fruit, nothing too strong. On the palate, however, a lot of that barrel, and I'm sorry I didn't mention, they're all aged in new, or let's say first fill American barrels, American bourbon barrels. And that barrel really comes through. You can really tell that's a first fill barrel. So on the palate, you get a little bit more of that fruity kind of malty note you'd expect from a single malt, but you really get a lot of that barrel influence. And it makes sense that they're doing it this way because when I talked to them, they actually mentioned that a lot of, or let's say the reason they make this whiskey is to use in most of their cocktails. And it tastes good in a cocktail. I wish my moonshine was so good when I mix it in a cocktail. The first cocktail I tried is their Monkey Shine cocktail. Now, I don't know if they started using their moonshine in the Monkey Shine and then switched over to new later. Might have been the idea, but they kept the name. And when they first bring you this, I mean, the first thing that came to my mind was Indiana Jones when they're cutting open the dead monkey head and eating the brains out, but thank God this experience was much better. For starters, the moment that they open the head up, you get a huge, like, woof of a lot of smell of vanilla and butter. And it's almost exactly, I don't know if you have a whiskey tasting set at home, but if you do, there's probably a butter and there's probably a vanilla. It smelled just like that, and it made me so thirsty and so hungry that the Monkey Shine didn't really last very long. So that was a very good thing. It was delicious. What was in it is essentially, I mean, I like to think it's like a whiskey sour, but without the sour, without the lemons. It actually has banana in there. So it was kind of like a creamy whiskey with sugar water mixed. Now, of course, they had other stuff in there as well. Delicious, heavily recommended. Try it. Definitely better than monkey brains. Now, I kind of took a break from the whiskeys, and then after I had finished the Monkey Shine, I went back to my Sackman 5. And I have to say, I was pretty impressed with this because the Sackman 5 is a pretty interesting whiskey. The distillery is interesting. They put a lot of information on their website. So they're very transparent about kind of the whiskey that you're tasting, where it came from, and the barrels that they actually used in making it. It is a blend. Now, transparency isn't always a good thing. There are lots of whiskeys which are transparent in what they're doing and how they're making it, but it still doesn't taste good. And I'm very happy to say I was really impressed with the Sackman 5. For only having 5 iterations of this whiskey or this kind of experimental barrel filling projects, and by the way, they do a lot of very interesting and very special barrel fills for the Sackman lineup, and this was definitely one of them. I was very impressed, I was very happy with this whiskey. They start off with a Carcavelos. I hope I'm pronouncing this right. I'll put the words up on the screen so you can see it and Google it, but it's a Portuguese wine. And this is the majority of the blend that they use. And it was pretty good. What's also very interesting is their barrel number or batch number. It's batch number 117. And they tell you when it was distilled. In this case, 2017. So pretty interesting. Again, I love those facts. I love those numbers. Usually you don't get those. You might get how old it is, but you won't know exactly when it was distilled and when it was put into the barrel. And because these are like a small batch release, you also know when they're bottled. So you have a good idea of every step or when every step in this process was taken. Now, I mentioned it's a blended whiskey. And by the way, single malt whiskeys, 2 times distilled in a pot still. I couldn't go visit the distillery. Their master distiller was not there, but I was able to look through a window they have in the back and check it out. And I gotta say, I loved it. Very cool distillery. I loved how simple it is, you can tell by looking at it, it looks like it's a steam jacketed inside still. There's no like gas burner under it, and for such a big still, I totally get it. But there's no automation. It's really a manual effort to distill this whiskey. And that's something that speaks to me a lot, especially when it's a good whiskey. But sorry, I jumped off topic. The other barrel that they used was actually a sherry barrel. And this sherry barrel was batch number 128, and it was distilled in 2009. But this whiskey did not stay in its same barrel. It was actually moved into a brandy wine barrel. It was finished in one. And this kind of makes sense because they make a brandy wine. And I didn't get to try that. Next time when I'm there for more than 2 hours, I can hopefully try out their entire line. But the whiskey was good, so I think that's going to be good as well. Now, as far as taste, I mentioned the single malt for their new whiskey didn't really stand out. It was good, but didn't have a lot of like really, let's say, really malty characteristics, something that really stood out from the grains which were used or the yeast that was used. Which really comes through with Sackman's is the barrels. And because they're using such interesting barrels and blending so well, it's actually okay and it's really good. That was the case here. Came through. So when I say came through, the barrel came through. There was a lot of sherry notes. I think the wine, and I'm not very knowledgeable about this type of wine or this barrel, but it kind of, in my mind, added a creamy characteristic to the whiskey, which was very good, very interesting, because you kind of had those sharp, dark fruit notes of the sherry, a little bit of cream, and what really stuck out to me was a little bit, just a hint of a bitter note. So if like the flavors start off like this, then you had a huge spike of bitterness, and then it went down, and then it started to finish with a long finish. Again, the wood really came through, and it was really interesting. By the way, that bitter note or even the creaminess could have come from the aging, from the finishing of the sherry barrels in the barley wine. I have no idea. This is something very new to me, and I would love to next time ask them where they think it came from. But it was super interesting. I loved it. Now, I also finished off with one last cocktail. I had a whiskey sour from them. And even when thinking about it and making this video, I had to make my own. And I make a lot of whiskey sours myself, as well a lot of old fashions. And that's kind of because I'm very picky with them. Especially in Europe, I haven't had a lot of good whiskey sours. Even in the US, I've had some bad ones. I really like a whiskey, a little bit of sugar, and whenever possible, a fresh squeezed juice, which you don't always get. Sometimes you get a bad syrup. Sometimes you get a lot of like water in the, like a bubbly water or like sparkling water in there. And I'm not a huge fan of that. I'm happy to say, their whiskey sour was one of the best I had, by far the best I've had in Spain. Now they have a few twists on this too. I'm going to leave those a secret. I really liked what they're doing with their whiskey sour, so much so that I've ordered some of the ingredients they used for my home bar, so I can actually make my own whiskeys like this as well, my whiskey sours like this as well. Definitely worth checking it out. It might be on their website, so maybe you can find out how they make their whiskey sours there, but it was really good. Overall, I loved my experience there. I recommend anybody who's in the area visiting Madrid to go check them out. They were so nice. The staff was so helpful and accommodating. Even though I was late for their lunch or missed lunch and I was too early for dinner, they kept the bar open for me. They served me some delicious food, which I really needed because I was kind of working on a lot of whiskey real quick. But it was amazing, and definitely a distillery that I will be happy to visit again. Sadly, I couldn't bring any bottles home with me. I was only traveling with my carry-ons. And I say bottles because they actually serve, or you can purchase them in 500 milliliter bottles, which means you can take 2 of them and have a liter, which is pretty good because then for tax reasons, it's not, you don't have to declare it or say anything, but you get 2, maybe you can mix and match them if they have 2 interesting special releases at the same time. But from a distiller to another distillery that's been doing it a lot longer than me, I really enjoyed Sackman. I've been to a lot of different distilleries in the US and in Europe, and there's not a lot that I can say so much positive or give so much positive feedback on. I look forward to visiting them again. And again, if any of you are in the area, have a chance to see them, I heavily recommend it. It is worth the Uber drive, and it is an experience which I think you're going to enjoy. Until you get a chance to check them out, cheers to you and your next, maybe Spanish whiskey, maybe whiskey sour, maybe monkey shine.